Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. I'm Dr. Iram Zulfikar, and this time we will be doing novel 2, modern drama together, modern novel together. The drama came to my tongue because the last time we were together for modern drama. It is going to be the same time frame and same time period that we will be discussing. However, the genre is going to be different. Previously it was drama, and this time it is going to be novel. However, the time remains the same. So this was a bit regarding myself. I hope that since we had done one course together, you are pretty familiar with your instructor and her style. But what you need to know for sure is about the course that we are going to do together. So let us have a formal course orientation for modern novel, that is novel 2. What we are going to cover in today's talk and how we are going to begin the introduction of this course will precisely cover the following features. We are going to discuss broadly about the 20th century. I hope this will be a kind of refresher for you because you have already done introductory discussion on the era. We will talk about the different aspects of this particular age, from Victorian age and rise of pessimism. And in that discussion, we will try to explore the important historical events in the period that helped shaping this form of literature that we are going to study. We will see what role women played in society that brought this gradual change. We will also try to look in the Edwardian and Georgian periods in 20th century in England. We will also discuss the 20th century England because we understand that language and culture, literature and culture, and for that sake society cannot stay separate. So we need to understand what was England, how was England in that time period. So we will try to capture the glimpses of England during 20th century, which will involve the historical developments of that time and little later than that. We will discuss particularly art in 20th century that helped shaping up the current form of modernism and postmodernism. We will precisely discuss the existence of fiction and notions of value that you will see flashing and buzzing in all the literature that you will study of that era. We will also discuss a modern view of time. What was that view? What was that point of view that you will find all authors and writers talking about? This view precisely captures the essence of the nature of consciousness that buzzes as stream of consciousness. When we talk of stream of consciousness, few names click our mind. What are those names? We will be discussing shortly under the caption of which writers we are going to study. We will try to discuss modernism a bit more in detail to see what are the views and questions that we can answer under this caption. We cannot understand modernism well unless we are aware of the themes it beget. Major themes in modern novel, major themes of modernism, and major themes of 20th century will also be a part of discussion. Well, when we talk about writers, we talk about theme, we talk about the settings of all that literature, we definitely need to talk about the thinkers, the philosophers of the time, and what thoughts they promoted in the society. So the major thinkers of the time, the famous thinkers of the time were Darwin, Karl Marx, and Sigmund Freud. And what thoughts they conveyed precisely are considered as impressionism and symbolism. We will also have a complete look at the modernist literature, discussing the stylistic feature, formal characteristics and thematic characteristics of modern literature. And we will finish our talk by giving a conclusive discussion of modernism, realism, and then we will try to conclude the discussion. I hope this will not be too much for the very first lecture, because most of these things you have already learned and discussed in previous course, modern drama. So these are going to be either a refresher for you or going to build up on already existing knowledge. So let us start with our discussion of lecture 1 of novel 2, and we will start by discussing the main writers, the 4 writers, famous writers of the time that we will be studying in this course. One of these writers is going to be James Joyce. James Joyce's time period is from 2nd February to 13th of January 1820 to 1941. And he was an Irish novelist and poet, considered to be one of the most influential writers in the modernist literature of the 20th century. He belongs to early 20th century, and his best writings, his best work includes Aloysius, that is a landmark work in which the episodes of Homer's Odyssey are paralleled in an array of contrasting literary styles. Perhaps most prominent among these, the stream of consciousness technique he perfected. Well, his other major works include short stories, a collection of short stories, Dubliners, and the novels, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, and Finnegan's Wake. His complete discussion also includes 3 books of poetry, a play, occasional journalism, and his published letters. So, what we are going to focus as far as James Joyce is concerned is his famous novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. The second writer that we are going to study is going to be a female writer, and her time frame is 1882 to 1941, almost the same time we studied the male writer James Joyce. And she was an English writer and one of the foremost modernists of the 20th century. During the interwar period, Woolf was a significant figure in London literary society and a central figure in the influential Bloomsbury group of intellectuals. I want you to have complete understanding of this Bloomsbury group of intellectuals of 20th century. This will let you understand what is this group about and how many members of this group are and who are these members and what role did they play in this time period. Her most famous work, Virginia Woolf's most famous works include the novels Mrs. Dalloway, To the Lighthouse, and Orlando. And the book-length essay, she was an essay writer as well, A Room of One's Own, with its famous dictum, a woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. Well, so this was Virginia Woolf. The third writer that we are going to do is Sir William Golding. Sir William Golding is a little later than both of these writers, and his time period is 1911, from 1911 to 1993. So he becomes in the middle of the century and almost covers the century. He was an English novelist, poet, playwright, and Nobel Prize holder in literature, and also best known for his novel Lord of the Flies. And just to let you know that this is going to be, Lord of the Flies is going to be the first reading we are going to have regarding William Golding. What we are going to do with Virginia Woolf, we are going to do her To the Lighthouse, the most famous bit of the time. So coming back to Sir William, he was also awarded the Booker Prize for Literature in 1980 for his novel Rites of Passage. The first book of the trilogy, To the Ends of the Earth. You know, trilogy is 3 consecutive of its type. Golding was also awarded both CBE and later elevated to a Knight Bachelor award. In 2008, the Times ranked this writer, Sir William Golding, as 3rd on their list of the 50 greatest British writers since 1945. So this is going to be the 3rd highlight of the century that you will be reading in this course. The 4th and the last writer we will cover will be, inshallah, Edward Forrest, E.M. Forster. The time period of Edward Forster is 1879 and 1970. So you can see the first 2 writers that we will be covering covers the early stage of 20th century, and the later of them, they are covering the later stages or the mid-century time period. He was also an English novelist, a short story writer, essayist, and librettist. He is known best for his ironic and well-plotted novels examining class differences and hypocrisy in early 20th century British society. Forster's humanistic impulse toward understanding and sympathy may be aptly summed up in the epigraph to his 1910 novel Howard's End. So you can take E.M. Forster as philanthropist too. His 1908 novel he has written in 1908, A Room with a View, is his most optimistic work, while A Passage to India that he did in 1924 brought him his greatest success. So his famous, rather most famous bit is A Passage to India. That is going to be our selection of his writings for this course. So far we have decided we'll be doing 4 of these writers and the 4 best writings by these writers. However, if we get enough time, if we are able to cover this text, selection of text in this time period, and we are left with some time, we will try to do a bit more of these writers if possible. So far this is about your course that you'll be doing, your syllabi. Now, before that, I start with the writers, or I start with the work they had written. We need to understand, or rather we need to refresh our understanding, our knowledge of the time in which this literature was produced, because we understand that literature can best be understood when it is put in relevance with the time and with the society in which it's written. So 20th century, beginning of 20th century begins with the late 19th century weakening of traditional stabilities. Now, we see what are the events and what are the moves of the time that consequenced in this instability. We will see that the important historical events in the period include the Boer War, the Irish Question. We will see that women's role in society gradually changed, and this role in specific relevance with their marriage and education had a big change in society. We will also see Edwardian and Georgian periods in 20th century in England that will give you highlights of social and economic stability and World War I. So these are some major events and moves that we need to know to understand this change that took place between the period Victorian age and 20th century. Now, what is it that makes it different from Victorian age and rise of pessimism? the aesthetic movement in 20th century, instances on art for art's sake. Do you remember art for art's sake? It caused the widening of the gap between the artist and the public. Alienation of the artist. When artist is busy in fantasizing and in portraying his fantasies, he is taken away from the realities of a layman, and he does not relate to the general, the real society anymore. From France came the tradition of the bohemian life that scorned the limits imposed by conventional ideas of respectability. So the rise of pessimism and stoicism. You see that when writers are busy fantasizing and portraying their fantasies, this gives birth to pessimism, because they are no more thinking about the problems. When you stop thinking about problems, you stop finding their solutions, and when you stop finding solution, you are no more an optimist. Now, what is this Boer War? That covers period from 1899 to 1902. It is an important historical event of the time. This war was basically fought by the British to establish political and economical control over the Boer publics of South Africa. That has marked both the high point of and the reaction against British imperialism. It was a war against which many British intellectuals protested, and one which the British in the end were slightly ashamed of having won. So this war is of great importance. You need to know about this war, because you will see the Bloom's group of intellectuals that we are talking, you will find most of this group is against this war, and once they have won this war, this is the achievement that they are slightly ashamed of. What is this Irish question that holds a prominent place in the historical events of this time? It also basically caused a great deal of excitement from the beginning of the period until well into the 1920s. A steadily rising Irish nationalism. In World War I, some Irish nationalists sought German help in rebelling against Britain. Now, what is this women's role, and what is this change that brought a reflecting change in society as well? We find that the Married Women's Property Act of 1882, which allowed married women to own property in their own right. Before this time, women did not have this right to own property in British law. The admission of women to the universities at different times during the later part of the century. And we also find that women were not allowed to take part in higher education, as a matter of fact, and it was this time period, this particular stage of history, where they were able to get this permission. However, still the society was not very welcoming. They could at least fight for it openly. The fight for women's suffrage, which was not won until 1918 and not fully won until 1928. So the early 20th century saw women suffering. This suffering was, in general, suffering of women, their rights, their education, their matrimonial life, their life as virgins, as bachelors. So in each field of life, they found themselves underprivileged, as as people who are ignored by society, who are oppressed by male chauvinistic culture. These events marked a change in the attitudes towards women, and in the part they played in the national life as well as in the relation between both of these genders, men and women. Then we see that Edwardian and Georgian periods in 20th century, how it is different from other periods or previous periods. This is a period of enjoyment and fleshiness, and it was marked by Edward VII's extrovert and self-indulgent character. It applies to a period in which the social and economic stabilities of the Victorian age remained unimpaired, though on the level of ideas there was a sense of change and liberation. It also refers to the social and economic stability of the Victorian age and the flourishing of the middle class. If you are able to recall the dramas that we discussed most of those modern dramas. They were dealing with the problems related to middle class morality. So this was the time when middle class started flourishing and developing and growing. Georgian period, the last phase of assurance and stability before the storm of World War I. So, 20th century England, what was those later historical developments which we need to understand or which we need to know before we start with the study? In 1920s, it was a post-war disillusion. We know war is not an event of its own time. War is an activity that covers the time before war, the time of war, and time after war. So, 1930s, depression and unemployment, followed by the rise of Hitler and fascism. So, 1920s, 1930s, you can see how there is rise of depression and disillusionment. Second World War, winning a war, Great Britain lost an empire, independence of India 1947 as well as of Pakistan. Although India and Pakistan elected to remain within the British Commonwealth, other former domains did not. The Irish Republic withdrew from the Commonwealth in 1949 and the Republic of South Africa in 1961. So these were the major changes of authority that took place during that time. Now, what is this art? What role it plays in 20th century, and how do we relate this change in art with the modernism? Modernism is a style or movement in the arts that aims to break with classical and traditional forms. It's a big change from traditions to non-traditional activity, from classical to something entirely different. It's a new age. Modernism is a new age with new values, needed a new art. What were those values? What were those requirements? And what kind of art it required are the questions we need to understand. You see some glimpses of modernist art. It's a picture of Mona Lisa, the most famous picture in the history of art. Leonardo da Vinci's artistic work. What beauty it holds as it's a symbol of beauty needs an eye to watch and observe. Then you see William de Kooning, Women of 1950. How does the painting portray the existence of women and basically the existence of the gender in the society? Do you see the abstractism? Do you see the use of color? Do you see the allusion and ambiguities embedded in the picture. All this will let you understand how this gender was perceived in that time, because we know that the art of painting is basically a reflection of the artist perception, and artist perception are highly influenced by the cultural and traditional perspective of the time. It includes all social values going on around the artist. Then you see famous Picasso's painting, again a kind of amalgamation, a kind of abstract disillusionment. I will call it disillusionment. You see, you cannot make anything very clear out of this picture. You will find human beings holding faces of animal. You will find human beings' body parts broken, and everything is a kind of destruction and disillusionment and breaking into pieces. And the use of colors you are seeing in the picture, it's more of dark tones, black and high tones of blues and royal blues. So royal blue is a color that deals with, that shows to some extent the authority of the time. So you can make so many things out of this picture. You can interpret it in any way. However, the most common thing that anybody would be able to see is kind of fragmentation that is shown in this picture, and it very well depicts the reflection of an artist like Picasso, belonging a typical time period of history. So modern art basically presented neo-primitivism. This is end of 19th century, and time is stepping into the 20th century. It's not a movement, it's a growing interest in African, Oceanic and Native American art that deals with the imposition of abstract forms on nature, where you need to deal with abstractism. Alright, so modern art is also Cubism, revolt against space, the popular 1907 and 1920s event, a simultaneous perspective, fragmentation into multiple viewpoints. So we are stepping into age, stepping into century, 20th century, that deals with abstractism, pessimism, fragmentation, and multiple viewpoints. And you see that here art flourished for art's sake. Another image, rather a few other images of the time, again Picasso's famous reflection, life with a bottle of rum that he presented 1911. Now, how do you see this picture? How do you see the use of colors? How do you see the objects used in this picture? What kind of selection the painter has made? If you get into the analysis of this picture, you will see and you will know a lot about the painter himself. Another reflection of the time that is titled as Table by a Window, 1917, that again gives you glimpses of the time. Now, from art, we are stepping into the study of fiction. How is fiction different in these time periods? The years 1912 to 1930, this was the post-war period as we discussed just now, the heroic age of the modern novel, and the names which would buzz in this age are Joseph Conrad, James Joyce, T.H. Lawrence, Virginia Woolf, and E.M. Forster. three major influences on the changes in attitude and technique in the fiction of this period. Now, what is different in the fiction of this time? There are three major changes. You see, this time period is from this is early 20th century. The famous name is Conrad, James Joyce, D.H. Lawrence, Virginia Woolf, and E.M. Forster. And there are three major changes that shape the attitude of fiction of this time. Now, what are these changes? More personal notions of value rather than public opinion. Artists, they are following their own personal opinions regarding everything. They are not representing public's viewpoint. A new view of time, not as a series of chronological movements, but a continuous flow in the consciousness of an individual. When we think of time as in three categories: past, present, and future. And to some extent, we are able to put these categories into watertight compartments, that if this is an event, this happened in past, this is happening now, and this may happen in future. So we are able to draw a boundary line between the categories in time. However, the new view of time changed, and it changed into the fusion of these watertight compartments. It says there are no strict boundaries. The boundaries are dissolving, they are disappearing. There are no more watertight compartments. Past may present in present, present may present in future, and future may present in present as well. So it's a kind of one flow of time. To make it correct, one flow of consciousness, a constant, continuous flow of consciousness that an individual has. And that is what is a new view of time, which was later given the name of stream of consciousness. Apart from having different values and view of time, the third major change was a new view of the nature of consciousness, which derived in a general way from the pioneer explorations of the subconscious by Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, but were also part of the spirit of the age. So if we broadly categorize them, these are two major things. However, can we later on divide it into three major changes in the time. Now, what is this more personal notion of value that differs from the notion which writer would already have, that was representing public's opinion? The novelist's realization that the general background of belief which united them with their public and a common sense of what was significant in experience had disappeared. The public values of the Victorian novel, in which major crises of plot could be shown through changes in the social or financial or marital status of the chief characters, gave way to more personally conceived notions of value dependent on the novelist's own intuitions and sensibilities rather than on public agreement. So that social representation of society, where different characters are taken as spokesmen of different kind of happenings in the society. A character is a major character of a kind of marital confusions. Different character is speaking regarding gender-biased issues. Now, this all changed into I would say one-man show. A writer is speaking for himself or herself rather, and taking care of his own her own intuitions and sensibility rather than a public agreement. So you see how this art for art's sake has emerged into a movement, and what were these tiny fragments which played their role into this movement. Now, what was the modern view of time? In the modern novel, time was not a series of chronological movements, but as a continuous flow in the consciousness of the individual. The view of time as a constant flow rather than a series of separate movements. Past does not remain only past, it is part of present. So this later on supported the nature of consciousness presented by the modern writers, that is influenced by the explorations of the subconsciousness by Sigmund Freud, a big name, and Carl Jung. Consciousness is multiple. The past is always present in it at some level and is continually coloring one's present reaction. Proust, in remembrance of things past, had explored the ways in which the past impinges on the present, and consciousness is determined by memory. So the view that our memories inevitably led to a technical revolution in the novel. By exploring into consciousness and memory, a novelist could write a novel concerned ostensibly with only one day in a hero's life, like Aloysius and Mrs. Dalloway. Only one day can be captured in the life of a character to write an entire novel on it, because that one day is not only one day, it has glimpses from past, it may have fancies for future. So now you will find in previous literature you will see that there was a time period that a writer will cover, probably a few days time, a week's time, and a story would be a strong organic whole of time as far as time and settings are concerned. However, the art produced during this time, one day of a character's life is ample, is enough to explore the life of a character, and the life of a character is representative of its society. There is no need of having so many characters or so many major characters. Novelists preferred to plunge into the consciousness of their characters in order to tell their stories rather than to provide external frameworks of chronological nature, chronological narrative. So now this was the general view of time that changed from fragmented and separated pieces of time into a continuous flow of time. And from there, this theory of consciousness, a continuous flow of time emerged. Now, what was this stream of consciousness that we need to understand as a major theme portraying most of the work written during 20th century? In this narrative technique, it's one of the narrative techniques. We know novel as form of genre, it belongs to prose, and prose is a form of narrative. It's narrative in form. So this is narrative technique. The author tries to render directly the very fabric of a character's consciousness without reporting it in formal coded remarks. It developed in 1920s. These are not lines, these are not dialogues delivered. You would see when dialogues are delivered, they are given quotation marks. These are lines spoken by the characters. However, stream of consciousness is different. It's a very smooth transition of a character into his or her own memories that would drag him back into past. Sometimes the character may have flashbacks. The character may have flashbacks in view of images from past, or the character may have memories. These memories can be the memories of a time when he or she is up, or when he or she is sleeping. So you will not find the text giving you clear clues of here the character is existing in the present, and in this line or in this part of the story character is moving back into his or her past. You will have to be conscious readers enough to understand it by yourself, that this is the time period where the character is present in his or her life, and this is the time period where he or she is referring to his or her past. This is very important to know because you will be needing this technique to understand the narrative technique of stream of consciousness to make yourself comfortable with 20th century literature. No pouch was constructed at the front of the novel to put the reader in possession of necessary preliminary information. Such information emerged as the novel progressed from the consciousness of each character as it responded to the present with echoes of the past. The readers are not given direct guidelines as how to understand. As I just mentioned, you will have to be conscious reader, critical and analytical reader to see where you need to draw the line between the characters present when they are existing in the story and when they are going back and visiting their own future. And one more thing is that no conventional signposts were put up to tell readers where they were, for that was felt to interfere with the immediacy of impression. So it's not only writers' liberty of writing, portraying a character. The thing that is taken care of is also the reader's immediacy of impression, that he's not to or she's not to disturbed during collecting the reflections from the text, having a dialogue with the text, having a conversation with the text, and he's given or she's, the reader is given this freedom to come with his or her own interpretation of its own type. So no conventional signposts are given, no conventional pouch or preludes or preliminary information is given. A reader has to be informed by him or herself enough to be a wise reader, to understand where a turn point comes in the reading. So this brings you, the readers in the limelight, putting a lot of responsibility on your shoulders. Okay, now concentration on the stream of consciousness and on the association of ideas within the individual consciousness led inevitably to stress on the essential loneliness of the individual. Loneliness of the individual is another important thing that the 20th century or literature of 20th century will detail in long length and will focus on as far as themes and characters are concerned. Now, after having the discussion based on the events and movements and changes in the literature and primarily in the attitudes of people and of writer that led to the change in attitudes of literature and literary forms, we need to discuss about what modernism is and what modernism, how does it reflect into the literature of modern times of 20th century. So once again, you need to know that a trend of thought that affirms the power of human beings to create, improve and reshape their environment is basically a kind of technique that the writers of modern times will use. With the aid of scientific knowledge, technology and practical experimentation, progressive and optimistic attitude, political, cultural and artistic movements rooted in the changes in Western society. At the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, you see that that a series of reforming cultural movements in art and architecture, music, literature, and the applied arts emerged in the 3 decades before 1914. This encouraged the re-examination of every aspect of existence, that is, from commerce to philosophy, all fields of human life. What was the goal? The primary goal was finding, which was holding back progress and replacing it with new, progressive and better ways of reaching the same end. New realities of the individuals, industries and mechanized age, which were permanent and imminent, emerged. What was the new worldview? The good, the true and the beautiful. We are seeing a post-war time. How genuinely this can be wonderful, beautiful and absolutely fine. This poses a question. It not only poses a question, it gives some of the answers to your questions of hows and whys too. This is known as a rebel against 19th century academic and historic tradition. Now you are seeing how things have evolved. Traditional forms of art, architecture, literature, religious faith, social organization, and daily life is all considered outdated. And modernism questioned. For all consciousness are unique and isolated. The existence of isolation is something you will find everywhere in modern literature. For all consciousness are unique and isolated. That means each individual is isolated and unique in his or her nature. And if this unique private world of an individual is the real world in which we live, how is true communication possible in such a world? That is a major question, lighting and flashing in each work presenting literature of 20th century. So, understanding and having this information of the time, how things evolved, why things evolved, what shape did they take, we need to understand what major themes of time were then portrayed into the writing. So major themes of the time of modern novel, of modernism, of 20th century are categorized into few forms. Isolation, estrangement, loneliness are few terms that you will find, few thoughts, philosophies, few reasons, few causes you will find everywhere in the literature. And who were these thinkers of the time which you would find playing with these ideas? The most disruptive thinkers of 20th century, of modern times, were Charles Darwin, a philosopher of biology, Karl Marx, a philosopher of political science, Sigmund Freud, a philosopher of psychology. Now, what were the famous theories offered by Darwin? Darwin says that theory of evolution by natural selection. He says survival of the fittest. Fittest will survive. His notion was human beings were driven by the same impulses as lower animals. There isn't any major difference. The basic impulses are same. So it's beings. The being thing is same for humans as well as animals. He undermines religious certainty of the general public, sense of human uniqueness of the intelligentsia, and ennobling spirituality. Karl Marx says that problems with the economic order were not transient, the result of specific wrong doers or temporary conditions. It is the result of specific wrong doers or temporary conditions. He fundamentally contradicts with the capitalist system. As well as Sigmund Freud is concerned, he says that human mind is a basic and fundamental structure. He says that subjective experience is based on the interplay of the parts of the mind. And he says all subjective reality is based on the play of basic desires, basic drives, and instincts through which the outside world was perceived. It's our own basic drives and instincts through which we perceive the world outside. He says a break with the past is external and absolute reality could impress itself on individual. There is no break with the past. Past always exists. Very dangerous philosophy though. So, if these were the thinkers of the time and these were their philosophies, what were the major thoughts of the time, the major philosophies of the time? Impressionism. Our school of painting, it focuses on work done outdoors. Human beings do not see objects but instead see light itself. Things do not exist. There is no form of concretism. Everything is in abstract form. It's light that exists, and we see that light do not has any boundaries. It's a kind of flattened existence that cannot be captured into a concrete boundary. That is Impressionism. Symbolism, language as expressly symbolic in its nature. Portrayal of patriotism, poetry and writing should follow connections that the sheer sound and texture of the words create. Representative writer, the post-war writers were more symbolic in the use of language that they use for literature. So, after knowing these bits, now we are moving towards see what is the modern literature. The literary form of modernism, and especially high modernism at its height from 19 to 1940. So the first two writers we are going to study, James Joyce and Virginia Woolf, are the writers of this time. We see these authors writing poems, and the famous writer for writing poems of modern literature was T.S. Eliot, and his famous work was The Waste Land. Robert Frost, W.B. Yeats, Ezra Pound. And if we talk about short stories and novels, we find James Joyce, William Faulkner, Ernest Hemingway, who's the old man in the sea, is still part of metric curriculum, I guess. Franz Kafka, Joseph Conrad, The Heart of Darkness, famous work. Virginia Woolf, F. Scott, and his work The Great Gatsby. D.H. Lawrence, Katharina Mansfield. So if we have an overview of the modern literature, we see that it moves from the bounds of realist literature. A literature has no more need to be a realist literature. It introduces concepts such as disjointed timeliness, fragmentation. It is distinguished by emancipatory meta-narrative. It is a kind of comprehension, explanation of historical experience or knowledge. It is also an explanation for everything that happens in a society. The modern literature moves away from romanticism. It does not talk about romanticism anymore. It ventures into subject matter that is traditionally mundane. For example, you will see the love song by J. Alford. Modernist literature has several features. If you are able to understand those features, if you are able to pick those features out, you are able to understand the style of modern literature. Three of these famous features are stylistic features, formal characteristics, and thematic characteristics. Now, what are these stylistic features? Marked pessimism. You will find modern literature as a marked pessimistic writing, a clear rejection of the optimism apparent in Victorian literature. So it's a rebel. It's totally against what happened so far in the history of literature. Common motive in modernist fiction is an alienated, isolated individual, a dysfunctional individual trying in vain to make sense of a predominantly urban and fragmented society. Do you remember Waiting for Godot? That is one piece of art that gives you a clear definition of this alienated, dysfunctional individual and his life. It has absence of a central heroic figure. You cannot easily figure out that this character is the heroic figure of the text. It has collapsing narrative. Narratives are collapsing and narrator into a collection of disjointed fragments and overlapping voices. Maybe repetitions, maybe overlapping and disjointed and fragmented. These were the some stylistic features. Some more are that it has concern for larger factors such as social or historical change. It demonstrates, and these are demonstrated in stream of consciousness writing. Some of the examples are Virginia Woolf, Mrs. Dalloway, James Joyce, portrait of the artist as a young man, as well as Essays, a reaction to the emergence of city life as a central force in society. These were the stylistic features of the modern literature. Now, some formal characteristics of the same type. It has open form, it has discontinuous narrative, fragmented, with jolts, with breaks. It has juxtapositions, and juxtaposition is two unlike things are put next to one another. A quality of being unexpected, unique, different, or you can say a traditional contrast. To compare and contrast the two to show similarities or differences. For example, a teacup and its saucer are expected. It has classical allusions. Allusions are different from illusions. Illusions starts with an I and allusion starts with an A. Allusions are historical references embedded in any literary text. We did discuss this aspect when we were doing the modern drama, and we are going to discuss it again now when we are doing modern novel. So just refresh your memory that allusion is different from illusion. It can be a figure of speech, it can be making a reference to or representation of a place, event, literary work, myth, or work of art. So where it comes up, unless you understand the background of that reference, you are not able to make meaning out of why it is referred to here and what meaning does it add in the text as a figure. For example, if I am discussing one story, one narrative, and I am saying that the writer is facing the Hamlet's conflict. What am I giving? I'm giving you a reference of a piece of work, literary work. Then I am taking you to a particular piece of work that belongs to Shakespearean writing. Shakespeare's famous character, Hamlet. And Hamlet's most famous conflict is his conflict of to be or not to be, of decision, of making a decision, right? So unless I know what was that conflict that Hamlet faced, what kind of position that conflict holds in the history of art and history of literature, I'm not able to make sense of the conflict the writer is referring to in his or her present writing. So, for that matter, if something altogether comes up that sounds alien to you, or you're not able to make connection between that reference and the text, you need to open up a dictionary of allusions and browse it and look for it. It can be directly or by implication. A reference can be a direct one, or reference can be explicit, or reference can be implicit. It is normally left to the reader or hearer to make the connection. As I had shared, no signposts are given, no preludes are given, no preliminary information is given. Things come up just like that. You being reader are all responsible to make connection for your understanding. However, don't worry, I will be helping you with that. However, still you need to pull your socks and be ready to deal with although very interesting but little challenging type of literature. So, formal characteristics also deal with borrowings from other cultures and languages. You may find words from other languages. You may also find words from other cultures. Unconventional use of metaphor. You understand what metaphor is, but you will find metaphor is used in an unconventional way. T.S. Eliot is famous for his 20th century literary use of metaphor, and his poem The Wasteland is a piece of art in that regard. Fragmentation and multiple narrative points of view, parallel viewpoints which are ongoing, juxtaposition, you will find them. Then you will also find free verse. Free verse is verse having a liberty of creating your verse. Styles of poetry that are not writing using strict meter or rhyme. We understand this characteristics of poetry, that poetry has a rhythm, and rhythm is created through a strict meter the writer follows in the verses. However, the poetry of the modern literature follows free verse. There is no strict limit of following verse. However, it is still recognizable as poetry by virtue of complex patterns of one sort or another that readers will perceive to be part of a coherent whole. Still, without meter, you'll be able to work it out that whether it's prose or poetry. That is the most easy identification that this type of art offers you. Yes, one very interesting and very complicated thing is intertextuality. Now, what is this intertextuality? It's coined by post-structuralist Julia Kristeva in 1966, and it is shaping text meaning by other text. Authors borrowing and transformation of a prior text. It is a kind of illusion, I would say. However, it is combining different type of text in order to add into the meaning of one particular text. Readers referencing of one text in reading another. So basically, intertextuality is a kind of more sophisticated form of illusion where text into text are referred in order to enrich the meaning of the writing as well as the understanding of the reader. Meta-narrative is another famous type of its formal characteristics. Sometimes master or grand narrative. Meta-narrative is a master narrative, is a grand narrative, a global or totalizing cultural narrative schema. Ordering and explaining knowledge and experience. The prefix meta means beyond. A narrative is story. A story about a story. So a meta-narrative is a story about a story. You may come across a character in the text that shares a story, and this story that he shares basically is about another story, so this becomes a meta-narrative. It encompasses and explains other little stories within totalizing schema. I can give you an easy example of that. You must have come across the stories, compilation of stories, Alif Laila, right? You see that Alif Laila is a kind of a tale book where there are so many tales relating to one particular event and maybe some particular characters. However, there are several stories inside, or there's one figure sitting somewhere around, maybe a grandfather or grandmother, who is sharing these stories. So it's basically one story that details other stories inside. It can be one, it can be two, it can be many of them. So this is called a meta-narrative. Okay, these were the stylistics as well as formal characteristics of modern literature. Now we need to talk about the thematic characteristics of modern literature. Thematic characteristics deal primarily with the breakdown of social norms and cultural sureties. It deals with dislocation of meaning in sense from its normal context. It also deals with valorization of the despairing individual in the face of an unmanageable future. And you will find rejection of historical and the substitution of a mythical past borrowed without chronology. It is product of the metropolis of cities and urbanscapes. Overwhelming technical changes of the 20th century were basically the reasons of this disillusionment. Disillusionment basically is a feeling arising from the discovery. Something is not what it was anticipated to be. For example, disillusionment is that you think of something, you perceive something, you have your illusions, and then you find something altogether different from this. This creates the feeling of disillusionment. More severe and traumatic than common disappointment. So, when you expect something and you get to receive something different from your expectation, naturally it brings disappointment to you. However, the intensity of this form, intensity of this terminology deals with not the common disappointment, but the kind of severe and traumatic kind of disappointment. So I would say, to make it easy for you, what we are dealing here is not a simple thing, but a superlative degree of disappointment, that is disillusionment. Especially when a belief central to one's identity is shown to be false. So one of the major theme of disillusionment is the belief regarding one's own identity or identity of people. So disillusionment will mostly deal with the false assumptions regarding identity of either people or norms or values. And then stream of consciousness, we have already detailed, we have already had a discussion about it, although we will be detailing it throughout this course. But again, it's a literary technique, a narrative technique rather. It portraying an individual's point of view, and by giving the written equivalent of the character's thought process. I discussed that it's a kind of disappearance of boundaries of time. Here, past, present, and future, they all exist together. Then, either in a loose internal interior monologue, what are different ways that the stream of consciousness is presented? So either you will find it in a loose internal interior monologue, that a character is thinking or having a dialogue in his or her own mind, or you will find it as in connection to his or her sensory reactions to external occurrences. Maybe he's or she's having flashbacks after having instances of present, linking his theories and his memories with his or her own past. So this was all about our today's talk, and let me quickly wind it up to refresh what we discussed today. You had a precise course orientation. When we started this lecture, we talked about 20th century, how it is different from Victorian age, and in that difference we discussed the major historical events, the role of women, the gradual change in society caused by the Edwardian and Georgian period, and the England of 20th century, what were those historical events that took place, art of the time, fiction, and notion and values of the time. So what was the modern view of time that developed, and how does it relate to the nature of consciousness that later formed the stream of consciousness, a major philosophy of the time? We understood modernism in detail by having an introduction, and in that we discussed different views and questions related to the modernism, and then major themes of the time. Thinkers of the time included Darwin, Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, the thoughts that they presented of impressionism and symbolism, and we had a look at the modernist literature by discussing what are the stylistics, formal and thematic features of modern literature are. Now we need to wind up this discussion on modernism by having a discussion, detailed discussion, another part of discussion that deals with a compact understanding of modernism, a complete review, and how does this relate to the realism in novel. And I hope that we'll be able to cover these two aspects in our second lecture of Novel 2. So that was all for today. I will see you next time, inshallah. Allah Hafiz.